Sarah Martinez walked into the mess hall at exactly 1800 hours, her boots making soft sounds on the polished floor. The large dining area buzzed with the usual evening chatter of soldiers finishing their dinner. She moved quietly toward the serving line, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing standard fatigues that gave no hint of her true background. At 28 years old, Sarah had spent the last 6 years as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to complete the grueling training program. But nobody at this Army base knew that. As far as everyone here was concerned, she was just another transfer from a different unit, assigned to help with some routine training exercises. She had arrived at Fort Campbell 3 days ago under orders that came directly from the Pentagon. The mission was classified, but simple enough on the surface. She was to observe the current training methods and provide recommendations for improvement. What the soldiers didn't know was that Sarah was evaluating them for potential special operations recruitment. The mess hall was crowded, filled with tired soldiers unwinding after a long day of training. Sarah grabbed a tray and moved through the line, selecting her meal without drawing attention to herself. She had learned long ago how to blend in, how to become invisible when necessary. It was a skill that had kept her alive in places most people couldn't imagine. As she looked for a place to sit, Sarah noticed 5 soldiers sitting at a corner table. They were loud, laughing at something one of them had said. She recognized them from the training exercises she had been observing. They were part of a squad that had been struggling with basic teamwork drills, and their attitude suggested they thought the exercises were beneath them. The leader of the group was a tall, muscular man named Derek Collins. He had been in the Army for 4 years and carried himself like he owned the place. His friends followed his lead in everything, from the way they talked to the way they treated newer soldiers. Sarah had watched them during training, noting how they bullied recruits and showed disrespect to their instructors when they thought nobody was looking. Sarah found an empty table near the wall and sat down to eat her meal. She preferred to observe rather than interact, gathering information about the soldiers' behavior when they thought they were off duty. This was often when their true characters showed through. The mess hall began to empty as soldiers finished their dinners and headed back to their barracks. Sarah ate slowly, in no hurry to leave. She was reading a technical manual while she ate, studying new combat techniques that had been developed since her last mission. That's when she heard Derek's voice getting louder from across the room. He was telling a story about some woman he claimed to have met in town, speaking in crude terms that made his friends laugh. Sarah didn't look up from her book, but she noticed that most of the other soldiers had finished eating and left. The mess hall was now mostly empty, except for herself, Derek's group, and a few kitchen staff cleaning up. Derek must have noticed her sitting alone because his voice got even louder. He seemed to be performing now, trying to get her attention with his inappropriate stories. Sarah continued reading, hoping they would just finish their meal and leave. But Derek had other plans. He stood up from his table and looked directly at her. "Hey there, lonely soldier," he called out, his voice echoing in the now quiet mess hall. "Why don't you come over here and join some real soldiers?" Sarah didn't look up from her manual. She had dealt with men like Derek before, and she knew that engaging would only encourage them. The best strategy was to ignore them and let them lose interest. But Derek wasn't the type to be ignored. He nudged one of his friends and started walking toward her table. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart," he said, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "It's not polite to ignore someone when they're being friendly." The other 4 soldiers followed Derek as he approached Sarah's table. They spread out around her, blocking her access to the exits. It was a classic intimidation tactic, meant to make her feel trapped and vulnerable. They had probably used it on other soldiers before, especially anyone they saw as weak or different. Sarah finally looked up from her book, making brief eye contact with Derek before returning her attention to the manual. "I'm just trying to eat my dinner," she said quietly. "Please, leave me alone." Derek laughed and sat down across from her without being invited. "Come on, don't be like that. We're all soldiers here. We should stick together." His friends chuckled, enjoying the show they thought Derek was putting on. "Besides," Derek continued, leaning forward across the table, "a little thing like you probably need some protection around here. This isn't exactly a safe place for someone who looks like they couldn't handle themselves in a real fight." Sarah closed her manual and looked directly at Derek. Her expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes that should have warned him to back off. "I can handle myself just fine," she said evenly. "Now please move so I can finish my meal." Instead of moving, Derek's friends closed in tighter around the table. One of them, a heavy-set soldier named Marcus, put his hands on the back of Sarah's chair. "What's the matter, Princess? You too good to talk to us regular soldiers?" he said, his breath smelling of the beer they had somehow smuggled into the mess hall. Another soldier, Tommy, picked up Sarah's manual and started flipping through it mockingly. "Look at this, guys. She's studying combat techniques. Maybe she thinks she's going to be some kind of warrior princess." He tossed the manual back onto the table carelessly. Sarah remained perfectly still, but those who knew her would have recognized the signs. Her breathing had become controlled and measured. Her posture, while appearing relaxed, was actually coiled like a spring. Her hands rested casually on the table, but they were positioned where she could move quickly if needed. "Listen," Derek said, his voice getting nastier. "We've been watching you for the past few days, walking around like you're something special, keeping to yourself, acting all mysterious. But we know what you really are. You're just another desk jockey who got assigned here by mistake." The fifth soldier, a thin man named Jake, laughed and added, "Yeah, you probably never even fired a weapon outside of basic training. What are you going to do if you actually face some real combat?" Sarah picked up her manual and started to stand, hoping to end the confrontation peacefully. But Marcus pushed down on her shoulders, forcing her back into her chair. "Nobody said you could leave yet," he said with a threatening smile. That's when something changed in Sarah's demeanor. The casual observer might not have noticed it, but there was a subtle shift in her entire presence. It was like a switch had been flipped, transforming her from a quiet soldier trying to avoid trouble into something much more dangerous. "Take your hands off me," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm but carrying a new edge that cut through the mess hall's air conditioning hum. Derek laughed and leaned back in his chair. "Or what? You're going to report us? Tell them we hurt your feelings?" His friends joined in the laughter, thinking they had found an easy target to push around. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, had been part of missions that would never be declassified, and had been trained by the best special operations forces in the world. She had faced down terrorists, survived firefights that would have broken lesser soldiers, and earned the respect of men who had initially doubted that any woman could handle the demands of SEAL training. But more importantly, they didn't know that Sarah had been taught by the best instructors in the military how to end fights quickly and efficiently. The training wasn't just about weapons or tactics. It was about reading situations, understanding when violence was inevitable, and knowing how to respond with exactly the right amount of force. The mess hall was now completely empty, except for the 6 of them. Even the kitchen staff had moved to the back areas, either not noticing the confrontation or choosing not to get involved. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the tables and chairs. Derek reached across the table and grabbed Sarah's wrist, squeezing it hard enough to leave marks. "Maybe you need to learn some respect for soldiers who've actually seen real action," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. That was the moment when Derek Collins and his 4 friends made the biggest mistake of their military careers. They had just put their hands on a Navy SEAL who had been trained to respond to threats with immediate and overwhelming force. And they had done it in a way that left her no choice but to defend herself. Sarah looked down at Derek's hand gripping her wrist, then back up at his face. For just a moment, her expression showed something that should have terrified him. It was the look of someone who had faced life-and-death situations and come out alive, someone who knew exactly what she was capable of doing. "You have 3 seconds to let go of me," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from real command experience. Derek tightened his grip instead, thinking he was calling her bluff. His friends moved closer, sensing that their intimidation was about to escalate to something more serious. They had no idea that they were about to learn a lesson that would change their entire understanding of what it meant to be a real soldier. The 3 seconds passed in silence. Derek's grip remained firm on Sarah's wrist, and his friends had formed a complete circle around her chair. They were all smiling, thinking they had successfully cornered someone they saw as weak. The mess hall's fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Then Sarah moved. It happened so fast that none of them fully understood what was occurring until it was over. In one fluid motion, Sarah twisted her captured wrist in a way that broke Derek's grip, while simultaneously causing him intense pain. Before he could react, she had grabbed his thumb and bent it back at an angle that made him scream and fall forward onto the table. But she wasn't finished. Using Derek's forward momentum, Sarah stood up and swept her leg behind his knee, sending him crashing to the floor. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, and Derek was now lying on the mess hall floor, clutching his injured hand and trying to figure out what had just happened. Marcus, the heavy-set soldier who had been standing behind her chair, tried to grab Sarah from behind. He wrapped his thick arms around her in a bear hug, thinking his size and strength would be enough to control her. It was another critical mistake. Sarah dropped her weight slightly, then drove her elbow back into Marcus's solar plexus with surgical precision. The blow hit exactly the right spot to knock the wind out of him, and his arms loosened around her. Before he could recover, Sarah grabbed his arm and used a basic judo throw to send him flying over her shoulder and onto one of the empty tables. The table collapsed under Marcus's weight with a loud crash that echoed through the mess hall. Food trays and utensils scattered across the floor as Marcus rolled off the broken table, gasping for air and unable to get back to his feet. Tommy and Jake, the 2 remaining soldiers who were still standing, looked at each other in shock. Their friends had just been taken down by someone they had assumed was helpless, and it had happened so quickly that they barely saw how she did it. But instead of backing down, their male pride kicked in, and they decided to attack together. Tommy came at Sarah from the left while Jake approached from the right, thinking they could overwhelm her with numbers. They had clearly never been trained in real hand-to-hand combat, relying instead on size and aggression. Against most opponents, it might have worked. Sarah had been expecting this move. She stepped back slightly, creating distance between herself and both attackers. When Tommy lunged at her, she sidestepped his charge and used his own momentum against him. She grabbed his extended arm and pulled him past her while simultaneously sticking out her foot. Tommy tripped and went sliding across the polished floor, ending up in a heap near the serving line. Jake tried to tackle her while she was dealing with Tommy, but Sarah had been tracking his movement the entire time. As he dove toward her, she simply moved out of the way and helped him along with a gentle push. Jake flew past her and crashed into a row of empty chairs, getting tangled up in the metal frames and unable to free himself quickly. The 5th soldier, a man named Rick, who had been hanging back, finally decided to join the fight. He was the smallest of the group, but also the angriest, humiliated by watching his friends get defeated so easily. He pulled out a knife that he kept hidden in his boot, thinking that a weapon would give him the advantage he needed. This was the moment when the situation shifted from a simple scuffle to something much more serious. Sarah saw the blade reflect the overhead lights as Rick pulled it out, and her training immediately kicked into a higher gear. Someone with a knife was a lethal threat, which meant she was now authorized to use whatever force was necessary to protect herself. Rick held the knife in front of him and started circling Sarah, trying to look threatening. "Let's see how tough you are now," he said, his voice shaking with adrenaline and fear. "Nobody embarrasses my friends and gets away with it." Sarah didn't respond verbally. Instead, she shifted into a combat stance that would have been recognizable to any special operations soldier. Her weight was balanced on the balls of her feet, her hands were up and ready, and her eyes never left Rick's face. She was no longer the quiet soldier trying to avoid trouble. She was now a Navy SEAL, dealing with a potentially lethal threat. Rick made the mistake of telegraphing his attack by drawing back his arm before lunging forward with the knife. Sarah had been watching for exactly this kind of movement. As the blade came toward her, she stepped inside Rick's reach and grabbed his wrist with both hands. Using a technique she had practiced thousands of times, she twisted his arm until the knife fell from his fingers, then continued the motion until his arm was pinned behind his back. Rick cried out in pain as Sarah controlled his arm with one hand while using her other hand to sweep his legs. He went down hard, and Sarah kept control of his arm to prevent him from getting back up. The knife skittered across the floor and came to rest against the wall, well out of reach. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Derek was still on the floor, holding his injured thumb. Marcus was struggling to catch his breath while sitting among the wreckage of the broken table. Tommy was untangling himself from the serving line, Jake was trying to free himself from the chairs, and Rick was face down on the floor with his arm controlled by Sarah. None of them were seriously injured, but all of them were in pain and completely humiliated. They had attacked what they thought was an easy target and had instead been systematically dismantled by someone who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Sarah released Rick's arm and stepped back, keeping all 5 soldiers in her line of sight. She wasn't even breathing hard while they were all groaning and trying to recover from their various injuries. The difference in their physical condition after the fight told the complete story of how outmatched they had been. "Stay down," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority. "All of you stay exactly where you are." The soldiers didn't argue. They were beginning to realize that they had made a terrible mistake, though they still didn't fully understand who they had just attacked. Sarah moved to the center of the mess hall, positioning herself where she could see all the exits and keep track of all 5 men at the same time. Derek slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position, still cradling his injured hand. "What the hell are you?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion and pain. "Nobody moves like that unless they've had some serious training." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was listening for sounds from outside the mess hall, making sure that their fight hadn't attracted attention from other soldiers or the military police. The last thing she wanted was for this incident to become a bigger issue that might compromise her real mission at the base. "You picked the wrong person to mess with," Sarah finally said. "You should have walked away when I asked you to leave me alone." Marcus managed to get back to his feet, though he was still holding his stomach where Sarah's elbow had connected. "You could have just told us you knew how to fight," he wheezed. "We were just trying to be friendly." "Friendly?" Sarah said, her voice showing the first sign of real anger. "You surrounded me, put your hands on me without permission, and one of you pulled a knife. That's not friendly behavior, that's assault." The soldiers looked at each other, beginning to understand how much trouble they were in. Fighting in the mess hall was bad enough, but the fact that Rick had pulled a weapon made it much worse. They could all face serious disciplinary action, including possible court-martial. Tommy finally freed himself from the serving line equipment and stood up slowly. "Look, we didn't mean for it to get out of hand," he said, trying to sound apologetic. "Maybe we can just forget this whole thing happened." Sarah shook her head. "It's too late for that. You made your choices and now you have to face the consequences." Jake was still struggling with the chairs that had fallen on top of him when the mess hall doors opened and 3 military police officers walked in. Someone in the kitchen must have called them when they heard the commotion. The MPs took one look at the scene and immediately radioed for backup. "Nobody move," ordered Sergeant First Class Williams, the lead MP. "Everyone stay exactly where you are while we figure out what happened here." Sarah raised her hand slightly to show she wasn't a threat, but she remained in a position where she could defend herself if necessary. The 5 soldiers who had attacked her were scattered around the mess hall, all of them looking worse for wear and clearly in no condition to cause more trouble. "Ma'am, are you injured?" Sergeant Williams asked Sarah while his partners began securing the area. "No, I'm fine," Sarah replied calmly. "These 5 soldiers assaulted me, and I defended myself. One of them drew a knife." She pointed to where Rick's weapon was still lying against the wall. The MP's eyes widened when he saw the knife. This was no longer a simple mess hall scuffle. Drawing a weapon on another soldier was a serious offense that would definitely result in criminal charges. "Can you give me a quick rundown of what happened?" Sergeant Williams asked, taking out his notebook to begin documenting the incident. Sarah gave a brief, factual account of the events, starting with the soldiers approaching her table and ending with Rick pulling the knife. She spoke in the clear, precise manner of someone who had given many mission reports, sticking to the facts and avoiding any emotional language. As she spoke, more MPs arrived to help process the scene. They began taking photographs of the damage and collecting evidence, including Rick's knife. The 5 soldiers were read their rights and placed under arrest, though they were allowed to seek medical attention for their injuries first. Derek looked up at Sarah from where he was sitting on the floor, his expression now showing respect instead of the mockery from earlier. "We had no idea," he said quietly. "If we had known you were special forces or something, we never would have started anything." Sarah looked down at him with an expression that was hard to read. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You shouldn't attack anyone, regardless of whether you think they can defend themselves. What you did was wrong, and the fact that I was able to stop you doesn't change that." The MPs finished their initial investigation and prepared to escort the 5 soldiers to the base detention facility. As they were being led away, Derek turned back to Sarah one more time. "What's your name?" he asked. "I think we deserve to know who just schooled us." Sarah considered the question for a moment. Her real identity and mission at the base were classified, but these soldiers would find out who she was eventually when the incident was fully investigated. "Martinez," she said simply. "Petty Officer First Class Sarah Martinez." Derek's eyes widened as he processed this information. Petty Officer was a Navy rank, which meant Sarah wasn't even Army. She was from a completely different branch of service, which made her skills even more mysterious and impressive. As the MPs led the 5 soldiers away, Sarah remained in the mess hall to give her full statement. Sergeant Williams was thorough in his questioning, and Sarah appreciated his professionalism. She could tell he was trying to piece together how one woman had managed to defeat 5 men so decisively without anyone getting seriously hurt. "Ma'am, your fighting technique was quite impressive," Sergeant Williams said as he finished writing up his report. "Where did you learn to handle yourself like that?" Sarah hesitated for a moment. Her SEAL training was classified information, and she couldn't reveal the full extent of her background without clearance from her commanding officers. "I've had extensive hand-to-hand combat training," she said carefully. "Beyond that, I can't really go into details." The MP nodded, understanding that there were limits to what military personnel could discuss about their training and assignments. He had seen enough soldiers with specialized backgrounds to know that some questions weren't meant to be answered in detail. "Will you need medical attention?" he asked. "Even if you don't feel injured now, sometimes the adrenaline can mask pain or injuries." Sarah shook her head. "I'm fine, Sergeant, but thank you for asking." As the MPs finished processing the scene and left the mess hall, Sarah found herself alone with the aftermath of the confrontation. Broken furniture, scattered utensils, and scuff marks on the floor told the story of what had happened. She felt a mixture of satisfaction and regret. Satisfaction because she had successfully defended herself against 5 attackers, but regret because the situation had escalated to violence at all. The next morning, word of the mess hall incident had spread throughout the base. Soldiers gathered in small groups, talking in hushed voices about the woman who had taken down 5 men by herself. The story grew with each telling, as military stories often do, with some versions having Sarah performing impossible feats of combat prowess. Sarah tried to go about her regular duties, but she could feel the stares and whispers following her wherever she went. Some soldiers looked at her with newfound respect, while others seemed wary or even afraid of her. She had hoped to maintain a low profile during her assignment, but that was no longer possible. At 0800 hours, Sarah received orders to report to Colonel James Harrison's office. Harrison was the base commander, a decorated veteran with 30 years of service, who had seen combat in multiple theaters. Sarah had been scheduled to brief him on her observations at the end of her assignment, but the mess hall incident had apparently moved up that timeline. She knocked on the colonel's door and entered when called. Harrison was sitting behind his desk, reading what appeared to be the MP report from the previous night. He looked up as she entered and gestured for her to sit down. "Petty Officer Martinez," Colonel Harrison said, setting down the report. "I've just finished reading about your eventful evening. 5 soldiers in the medical bay, 1 facing weapons charges, and a mess hall that needs repairs. Care to explain what happened?" Sarah sat at attention and gave the colonel the same factual account she had given the MPs. She spoke clearly and precisely, describing the events without embellishment or emotional language. Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad. "The MP's report indicates that you showed considerable restraint," Harrison said when she finished. 5 men attack you, 1 with a knife, and none of them require serious medical treatment. That suggests a level of training and control that goes beyond standard military instruction. Sarah remained silent, waiting to see where the colonel was going with his observations. Harrison leaned back in his chair and studied her carefully. "I received some interesting phone calls this morning, Martinez. It seems your presence here has attracted attention from some very high-ranking people. People who want to make sure you're not compromised by this incident." "Sir?" Sarah said, though she was beginning to understand what Harrison might be getting at. "I've been in the Army long enough to recognize when something doesn't add up," Harrison continued. "A Navy petty officer assigned to observe Army training exercises, who happens to have fighting skills that let her take down 5 soldiers without breaking a sweat. That tells me there's more to your story than what's in your official transfer orders." Harrison picked up his phone and made a brief call. "Send him in," he said to whoever answered. A moment later, the door opened, and a man in civilian clothes entered the office. He was tall and lean, with the bearing of someone who had spent serious time in special operations. Sarah recognized him immediately, though she kept her expression neutral. "Martinez," the man said with a slight smile. "I hear you've been making friends with the local soldiers." "Commander Peterson," Sarah replied, standing to attention. "I wasn't expecting to see you here, sir." Peterson was Sarah's handler for this assignment, a former SEAL who now worked in intelligence and special operations planning. His presence here meant that the mess hall incident had reached the attention of people much higher up the chain of command than she had anticipated. Colonel Harrison looked between the two of them, clearly realizing that he was now in the middle of something much larger than a simple mess hall fight. "Commander, I think it's time someone explained to me what's really going on with Petty Officer Martinez's assignment to my base." Peterson nodded and sat down. "Colonel, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. Petty Officer Martinez is not here to observe training exercises. She's here to evaluate your soldiers for potential recruitment into a new Joint Special Operations Unit." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Special Operations recruitment? Why wasn't I informed of this?" Because the evaluation needed to be conducted without the soldiers' knowledge, Peterson explained. We wanted to see how they performed under normal conditions, not when they were trying to impress special operations recruiters. And what does last night's incident mean for that evaluation? Harrison asked. Peterson looked at Sarah, who understood that she was now authorized to speak more freely about her observations. Sir, the 5 soldiers who attacked me last night represent exactly the kind of behavior we're trying to identify and eliminate from special operations candidates, she said. They showed poor judgment, lack of discipline, and a tendency toward bullying behavior that would be completely unacceptable in elite units, Sarah continued. More importantly, they demonstrated that they can't be trusted to treat their fellow soldiers with respect and professionalism. Harrison nodded slowly. I see. And what about the other soldiers you've been observing? Sarah opened the folder she had brought with her and pulled out several pages of notes. I've identified 12 soldiers who show exceptional potential for advanced training. They demonstrate the kind of character, discipline, and tactical thinking that we look for in special operations candidates. She handed Harrison a list of names. These soldiers consistently showed leadership, teamwork, and ethical behavior even when they thought no one was watching. They're exactly the kind of people we want to recruit. Peterson stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the base where soldiers were going about their morning routines. The incident last night actually provided us with valuable intelligence, Colonel. It confirmed our assessment of those 5 soldiers and demonstrated that Martinez has maintained her cover effectively. Maintained her cover? Harrison asked. Yes, sir, Sarah replied. Part of my evaluation required that I present myself as an ordinary soldier rather than revealing my special operations background. If the soldiers had known they were being evaluated, they would have modified their behavior accordingly. Harrison picked up the MP report again and read through it once more. So those 5 soldiers had no idea they were attacking a Navy SEAL? That's correct, sir, Peterson confirmed. And Martinez handled the situation exactly as she was trained to do. She used the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat while avoiding any permanent injury to her attackers. Even though one of them drew a knife on her, Harrison added. Sarah nodded. Sir, my training taught me to assess threats accurately and respond proportionally. Rick was angry and scared, but he wasn't a trained killer. I was able to disarm him without causing serious harm. Peterson returned to his seat and looked at both Harrison and Sarah. This incident actually accelerates our timeline, Colonel. We were planning to complete the evaluation over the next 2 weeks, but Martinez's cover has been compromised. Every soldier on this base now knows she's more than she appears to be. What do you recommend? Harrison asked. We proceed with recruitment immediately, Peterson replied. Martinez has identified the candidates we want, and we can begin the selection process right away. The soldiers who attacked her will face military justice, and will use their case as an example of the kind of behavior that disqualifies someone from elite units. Sarah spoke up. Sir, there's one more thing to consider. The soldiers I've recommended for recruitment witnessed how I handled the situation last night indirectly through the base rumors. Their reactions to hearing about it could be a final test of their character. How so? Harrison asked. The soldiers with real leadership potential will be concerned about what happened to me and disappointed in their fellow soldiers' behavior, Sarah explained. The ones who aren't suitable for special operations will either be intimidated by what I did or impressed by the violence itself. Peterson smiled. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made you such an effective SEAL, Martinez. Use the incident as a final evaluation tool. Over the next 3 days, Sarah's assessment proved accurate. The soldiers she had recommended for recruitment approached her to express concern about the attack and to apologize for their fellow soldiers' behavior. They demonstrated the kind of character and judgment that special operations units required. Meanwhile, other soldiers either avoided her completely or tried to get close to her for the wrong reasons, hoping to learn fighting techniques or to impress her with their own toughness. These reactions confirmed Sarah's evaluations and helped Peterson's team make their final selections. The 5 soldiers who had attacked Sarah faced court-martial proceedings. Derek and Marcus received reductions in rank and forfeited pay, while Tommy and Jake were given administrative punishments and additional training. Rick, who had drawn the knife, faced more serious charges and was ultimately discharged from the Army. Before leaving Fort Campbell, Sarah met with each of the 12 soldiers she had recommended for recruitment. She explained who she really was and what she had been doing at the base. Their reactions ranged from surprise to excitement, but all of them expressed interest in learning more about special operations opportunities. "The training will be the hardest thing you've ever done," Sarah told each of them. "It will push you beyond every limit you think you have, but if you make it through, you'll become part of something bigger than yourself." On her last day at the base, Sarah walked through the mess hall one final time. The damaged furniture had been replaced, and there was no visible sign of the confrontation that had changed everything. But she knew that the incident would be remembered and talked about for years to come. Colonel Harrison found her there and joined her for a cup of coffee. "You know, Martinez, in 30 years of service, I've never seen anything quite like what you did that night." Sarah looked around the quiet mess hall. "I hope I never have to do anything like it again, sir. Violence should always be the last resort." "But when it's necessary, it helps to know what you're doing," Harrison replied. "Those 12 soldiers you recommended are lucky to have you as their example of what a real warrior looks like." As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Campbell and return to her regular duties, she reflected on the unexpected turn her assignment had taken. What was supposed to be a quiet evaluation mission had become a dramatic demonstration of the principles she had sworn to uphold as a Navy SEAL. The incident in the mess hall would follow her throughout her career, but not as a source of shame or regret. Instead, it became a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight to protect yourself and uphold the values that make military service meaningful. 5 soldiers had learned a hard lesson about respect and consequences. 12 others had discovered new opportunities for service and growth. And Sarah Martinez had proven once again that being a Navy SEAL meant much more than just knowing how to fight. It meant knowing when to fight, how to fight with honor, and how to turn even the most challenging situations into opportunities to make the military stronger and better.